Article 13, Paragraph 1 of the Constitution of the Republic of Korea sets forth the principle of double jeopardy. This means that one is not punished repeatedly for the same criminal offense. If a judgment becomes final after the first trial and the second trial, and finally in the Supreme Court, then under the principle of double jeopardy, no further review or trial is conducted. Of course, there are exceptions. If a guilty verdict has been pronounced and new powerful evidence appears, and it is deemed to have sufficient value to seriously discuss an acquittal, a retrial is pursued. But as you know, that is not easy. In other words, to restate it, if the Supreme Court declares not guilty for a suspect, then even if evidence or witnesses later appear that could prove a murder, the person cannot be brought to trial. Today's case is one in which this obvious and basic principle feels quite resentful in practice. On the morning of Tuesday, the 21st of October of 2003, near a stream in Dongducheon, Gyeonggi-do, a 36-year-old woman surnamed Cho was found dead inside a parked galloper vehicle. At the time of discovery, the doors of the vehicle were locked and the headlights were off. However, the engine was on. The heater was also running continuously on level 3. For reference, the galloper is a diesel vehicle. Exhaust gas produced by diesel combustion contains carbon monoxide. This is a very harmful gas that can cause acute asphyxiation. It is colorless and odorless, making it difficult to perceive. Thus, if all the windows are up and the heater is left on for a long time, the concentration of carbon monoxide rises rapidly, and there is a risk of death. And for that reason, the death of Ms. Cho could easily have been regarded as a simple accident. However, the distinct bruise left on her neck indicated a completely different scenario. The mark ran thin and long in a straight line from the front part of the neck. This means that someone strangled her with a thin cord from the back seat. It is an obvious sign of homicide. First, let us look at who Ms. Cho was. She managed the sale of candles and incense and handled the temple's operations at a temple located about 6 3/10 kilometers from the scene. The temple's head monk was none other than her husband, Mr. Park, 51 years old. He was not a typical monk. He was what is called a daekoseung in Korea, a married monk permitted to marry, have children, and eat meat. This status was officially recognized in Japan in the year 1872 and was introduced into Korea during the Japanese colonial period. Ms. Cho was living with her daekoseung husband and raising 2 children. However, the marital relationship was not very good. From about 3 years prior, there had been frequent quarrels, and it kept worsening. Eventually, on Thursday, the 11th of September of 2003, Ms. Cho declared, "I cannot live like this. I will get a divorce," and went to her younger sibling's home in Gangneung. In early October, she returned home. By then, the couple's relationship was already ruined beyond repair. They were, of course, using separate rooms, and the photos of them together had all been torn up. Ms. Cho had only returned to help with tasks necessary for running the temple. The last time Ms. Cho was seen was the night before the body was found, on Monday, the 20th of October, at 11 o'clock at night. She had watched a drama at a friend's house and then returned to the temple. It is estimated that she arrived at around 11:50 at night. Based on this, the time of the crime is narrowed to the period from 11:50 at night to the following morning. First, the police, citing the couple's serious discord, designated her husband, the monk, Mr. Park, as the first suspect. However, he had a perfect alibi. On that day, October 20th, it happened to be the memorial day for his older brother and sister-in-law. He stated that from 11 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock the next morning, he continuously conducted ancestral rites in the Dharma Hall. This was witnessed by family members as well as other monks. It was a solid alibi. Next, the police canvassed people connected to the temple. They asked many questions, such as whether any suspicious person had come and gone at the time or whether anyone had heard strange sounds, and among them, they noticed one person who appeared particularly uneasy. He was a 46-year-old man surnamed Kim. Even from some distance, he had a very anxious look in his eyes, and his hands were trembling. When police approached and asked him a few light questions, he stumbled over his words and could not say a single sentence properly. That was suspicious. So the police said, "Please accompany us for a moment," and took him to the ravine where the body had been found. At that time, a post-mortem examination was underway, so Mr. Kim saw this as well. He became greatly agitated and turned his head away. The police pressed him. However, Mr. Kim denied committing the crime. The situation was certainly suspicious, but without definite evidence, they could not proceed based on intuition alone. Meanwhile, the police discovered an old truck parked next to the temple. When asked what truck it was, Mr. Kim said, "It was discarded, and I picked it up and have been using it." Here the police found a small gap. "Then did you steal this truck?" They seized on the pretext. Using this as a pretext, they brought him to the station. There, the investigation relating to the homicide continued. As various questions were asked, Mr. Kim realized that the police continued to suspect him, and he suddenly fell into deep thought. Then he demanded that the head monk, Mr. Park, be brought in. By way of background, Mr. Kim was in fact a hangjasung, meaning a postulant who practices at a temple for a set period before becoming an ordained monk. His highest level of education was only elementary school, so he could not write Korean properly. In the past, he had run a dog farm. One day, he met the head monk, Mr. Park, received an invitation, and entered the temple. Thereafter, he revered Mr. Park almost like a deity and showed unconditional loyalty. Within that relationship, the police's instincts sharpened. Perhaps the hangjasung Mr. Kim, acting on orders from the head monk Mr. Park, had killed the wife. At 7:40 in the evening on Tuesday, the 21st of October, Mr. Park appeared at the Pochon police station. At that time, Mr. Kim and Mr. Park were allowed to talk for 5 minutes without an officer present. After that, as if he had organized his thoughts, Mr. Kim finally confessed everything to the detective. He said he had long harbored many complaints against Ms. Cho. She was the wife of the head monk, and she oversaw the temple's household, various events, and money matters. That would have been natural. Mr. Kim assisted her by selling candles, incense, rice, and similar goods to believers. Then, during Buddha's birthday in early May, he sold goods and handed the proceeds to Ms. Cho, saying, "I sold these." But she began to suspect him, asking, "Why is the money short?" The same thing happened on 2 other occasions. Ms. Cho frequently called him out and scolded him, saying, "Isn't your management of the credit card holding public funds sloppy? Aren't you handling the shared van too roughly? And why do you cook as you please?" And he was scolded for every little thing. Mr. Kim felt his face was being publicly shamed, and his anger gradually piled up until he planned a murder. At 1 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, the 21st of October, Mr. Kim called Ms. Cho, saying that he had something to say about the sales proceeds. He wanted to talk in a quiet place, so they drove out from the temple and entered local road number 334. It was late and deserted, and not a single car passed by. At this time, Mr. Kim suddenly said he urgently needed a restroom and asked her to stop the car. Then, he secretly approached and strangled Ms. Cho from behind with the seatbelt. He then left the body and vehicle in the ravine and walked back to the temple alone. Having heard this confession, the police nevertheless felt something was not quite right. The motive was that he was suspected over money and meddling, and therefore got angry and killed. But even as he confessed, Mr. Kim did not seem to have the strong grudge one would expect for a murder. Critically, several circumstances did not match. In addition, it did not match the autopsy results. Earlier, he said he strangled with a seatbelt, but Ms. Cho showed marks of being strangled with a thin cord. Something was wrong. So the police kept pressing him to confirm the facts. But from then on, Mr. Kim remained silent and did not open his mouth. There had to be some inside story. In this frustrating situation, someone appeared who flipped the board. It was Mr. Kim's older brother. During a visit, he angrily pressed his younger brother, saying, "Do you know what that guy is doing now? He is hiring a lawyer to pin everything on you. Do not get swept up and tell the truth about what Mr. Park ordered you to do." Up to that point, Mr. Park had been explaining that his wife Ms. Cho and the Hangjasung Mr. Kim were in an adulterous relationship. He had also said that when his wife ran away from home, she had enjoyed the future with Mr. Kim, and that in the temple the two met in secret. When Mr. Kim learned all this, he fell into great shock. To him, Mr. Park was a teacher and someone he revered like a god, and he thought Mr. Park would simply get him out. But when they met earlier at the police station, Mr. Park had told him to say that he strangled her with a seatbelt and that outside the temple he had acted alone, and he had ordered him to say it like that. Trusting that, Mr. Kim had given the expected false confession, but being branded an adulterer made him immediately change his stance. He told the detective about Mr. Park's incitement to murder. He also confessed to the details of how things proceeded under Mr. Park's instructions. The conflict between the wife, Ms. Cho, and the head monk husband, Mr. Park, had begun about 2 years earlier. One day after the couple had sexual relations, the wife contracted a sexually transmitted infection. She was infected with pubic lice and herpes simplex virus type 2. For reference, pubic lice are insects that parasitize pubic hair and are transmitted mainly through sexual contact. The husband insisted he had never had sexual contact that could cause such a disease, but his adultery was effectively certain. With strong suspicion, she secretly checked his phone and email, and there she found a record of an hour-long call with an unfamiliar woman. The decisive reason the relationship deteriorated was this. The two kept arguing thereafter. At some point, they exchanged threatening words such as, "I will kill you." Ms. Cho went further and made remarks belittling her husband's sexual capability, saying, "You do not even get an erection, and you only poke around." And she mocked him. In front of believers, she also disparaged him, saying that even though he was a head monk, he had committed adultery. Then in October of 2001, Ms. Cho ran away to her sister's home. She was away for 3 days. When she returned home, her husband instead questioned her, saying, "What did you do while you were away from home? Did you sleep with another man?" And he suspiciously reversed the blame. Their relationship had cracked to the point that it really could not be mended. Then, in the winter of 2002, Ms. Cho visited her parents' home for the children's winter vacation. Mr. Park stayed behind to take care of the temple. But strictly speaking, he was not alone, but with another person. Incredibly, he brought another woman into their home. When the wife, Ms. Cho, later found this out, she was furious. In the master bedroom that the couple used, she said, "You did filthy things with that woman," and threw away the bed and bedding that had been there. She also tore up the photographs. In the end, in September of 2003, she declared divorce and left the house. She found a job in Poshan and returned on the 28th, but thereafter, they used separate rooms and did not interfere with each other. Usually after work, Ms. Cho practiced word processing or exercised, and then came home late at night only to sleep. If she came home early, she would constantly have to face her husband. Seeing his wife completely turn her back on him, Mr. Park began to suspect that she had a new lover. He felt that only by getting rid of his wife would his mind be at ease. He could not do it himself. So he set up Mr. Kim as a puppet. Mr. Kim was a bit simple, and he obeyed any order from Mr. Park as a loyal disciple. In September of 2003, Mr. Park told Mr. Kim, "I think my wife has fallen for another man. Before that guy comes to kill you and me, we must act first," which was a preposterous story laid as groundwork. Mr. Kim, hearing this, wondered why anyone would attack them, but he seems to have been gradually indoctrinated. At 11 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, the 16th of October, Mr. Park gave Mr. Kim an unidentified powdered drug, calling it a sleeping pill. He instructed him to mix it and, once Ms. Cho fell asleep, to strangle her. He also told him to test whether it dissolved well by mixing it with baekseju and ogapiju, Korean alcoholic beverages. Even the idea of testing this was frightening. When Mr. Kim hesitated, 2 days later on Saturday, the 18th, Mr. Park called him again. This time, he handed over 17 tablets and ordered him to kill once more. Listen carefully. When the children come home from school today, I will take them to the light airplane field in Hwaseong. We will only be back tomorrow afternoon, but you must absolutely give the medicine to my wife and have her dead. I have a perfect alibi, so I will not be suspected. And you just say you slept in your room. You must handle it today. After giving all those instructions, Mr. Park left. The next day, when he returned, his wife was still alive and well. Mr. Kim had gone to Ms. Cho the previous night, but his heart weakened and he could not bring himself to kill her. When this first attempt failed, Mr. Park again called Mr. Kim to the refectory and this time coaxed him gently. If anything goes wrong, I will send you to Myanmar. We happen to be building a large temple there, and you will be promoted to head monk there. He also said, there is no extradition cooperation between Korea and Myanmar. Even if you are caught, you will not be returned to Korea, and he reassured him. Is this something that a monk should be saying? In the end, Mr. Kim was swayed by the sweet words and the promised reward. D-Day was set for Monday, the 20th of October. Moreover, that day was the memorial day for Mr. Park's older brother and sister-in-law, so it guaranteed a perfect alibi for Mr. Park. That evening at 7 o'clock in the refectory, after hearing Mr. Kim's situation and story, the two men discussed the method of murder in detail. Mr. Park suggested, "Shall we beat her to death with a hammer?" Mr. Kim, trembling, refused, saying, "What if she screams, 'I am scared'?" Then Mr. Park went to the temple storage and brought back a coil of laundry line of 18 meters. "You will strangle her to death with this." Mr. Kim took it, and they discussed doubling it to strangle the neck. Mr. Park demonstrated right there how to place the line to strangle. When Mr. Kim attempted to imitate, Mr. Park said, "No, the cord must be thin so that it digs deep into the neck." And then he said, "Cut it to about 60 centimeters." He ordered a diagonal cut at the end to fool the police. The meaning was that if the cord used in the crime were later compared to the remaining spool, the cut surfaces would not match and the investigation would be confused. Then Mr. Park and Mr. Kim practiced further. In front of a pillar, Mr. Kim sat on a wooden chair, and Mr. Park instructed, "Sit, place the cord exactly above the Adam's apple," and he trained him. They did a final rehearsal, even in the van. At 11 o'clock at night, Mr. Park called Mr. Kim one last time and reminded him of the specific method. "When my wife arrives at the temple, use the memorial rites as a pretext and naturally get into the back seat of her car. At the right moment, strangle her with the laundry line. Move the body once to the passenger seat. Then you drive. You know the double circle restaurant. Drive the car into the ravine to the right of it. Then move the body back to the driver's seat. You must turn the heater to level 3. Make sure to take her bag and cell phone. Do not forget your cotton work gloves. Wipe down all your fingerprints and come back. Lock the car and return to the temple along the ravine where no one is around." It was an extremely specific and terrifying plan, but Mr. Kim was somewhat simple. He was very afraid. He asked, "Master, how can I make my way back alone along the ravine in the pitch-dark dawn?" Mr. Park handed him a flashlight. At 11:50 at night, the sound of Ms. Cho's vehicle entering the temple grounds was heard. Mr. Kim hurried outside. At that time, Mr. Park was conducting the memorial service. Mr. Kim spoke with Ms. Cho and naturally got into the back seat. They then drove a short distance, and seizing a moment when no one was around, he strangled her. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he followed Mr. Park's instructions and sent the body and the vehicle into the ravine. He abandoned the scene, and with only the flashlight, returned along the ravine to the temple. That day, in the midst of the rites, Mr. Park had briefly left, saying he would stop by the refectory. At that time, he met Mr. Kim and received his wife's bag and cell phone and the laundry line that had been the murder weapon. He put them all into the stove and burned them. It was thoroughly executed. Having received all of Mr. Kim's confession, the police decided to indict based on it. The prosecution also indicted Mr. Park for solicitation of murder and Mr. Kim for murder, respectively. With all the confessions out, a smooth trial was expected, but to state the conclusion first, the Court of First Instance acquitted Mr. Park for lack of evidence. The First Instance Court accepted Mr. Park's claim that Ms. Cho and Mr. Kim were in an adulterous relationship. Two important witnesses played a role. A laywoman said, "I think I heard sounds as if the two were engaging in sexual intercourse," and testified. Another witness was the victim, Ms. Cho's son, who testified that in the summer, while riding his bicycle, he saw his mother and Mr. Kim hugging in a room. This became a decisive testimony. Mr. Park was acquitted, and Mr. Kim was sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, in the appellate trial held in August of 2004, the situation was reversed. Mr. Kim's sentence remained the same, but Mr. Park's solicitation of murder was recognized and changed to 15 years in prison. In the second instance, the court found that Mr. Kim's testimony was more specific and that the strangulation marks on the body matched the confession exactly. Contrary to the first instance, the suspicion that the two were in an affair was not recognized. Regarding the two important testimonies, the court held that the laywoman's account was merely that she heard moaning and that it was difficult to infer that specific persons were having intercourse. As for the son, since his father was Mr. Park, the possibility that he testified favorably to his father's request could not be excluded. Another interesting point was this. Earlier, Mr. Kim was described as someone who had not properly learned Hangul and had low resistance. For such a Mr. Kim to have made up stories about investigative cooperation systems between Myanmar and Korea is difficult to accept. On the other hand, Mr. Park had frequently traveled to Myanmar for work. From this, the court judged that Mr. Park was clearly involved. Moreover, above all, let us look at Mr. Park's demeanor. Who is Mr. Kim? He had become the murderer of Mr. Park's wife. Yet instead of showing anger or hostility, Mr. Park showed no animosity, and with a gentle attitude, he came to the police station and matched stories, asking, "You killed her like this and like that, right?" All of this was suspicious. Having received 15 years for solicitation of murder, Mr. Park, of course, said, "No, I am wronged. Mr. Kim's confession is all false," and appealed. And Mr. Kim continued to say he had killed her. In April of 2005, the final trial was held at the Supreme Court. At that time, Mr. Park hired one of Korea's 5 major law firms and poured in a large sum of money. As to where he obtained that large sum, no one knew. At any rate, the trial began to flow in his favor. To state the conclusion, the Supreme Court ruled that there were no urgent circumstances or property reasons requiring Mr. Park to have his wife Ms. Cho killed, and rendered a not guilty verdict for solicitation of murder. In other words, they reasoned that since there was no reason to kill, there was no solicitation to kill. Thus, the murder case of Miss Cho ended somewhat emptily. But it was not over yet. 7 years after the judgment, in January of 2012, there was an unexpected twist. An employee at an insurance company, while reviewing old high-value claim files, discovered Ms. Cho's file. Glancing through it, he noticed something odd. He found that the deceased Ms. Cho had enrolled in 3 whole-life insurance policies, carrying large death benefits, and that she had been killed only 7 months later. In addition, the policies had a special rider. If death was accidental rather than by illness or natural causes, the benefit would be paid at 3 times the amount. As a result, after his wife died, Mr. Park received as much as 800 million won, which is approximately 590,000 US dollars at about 1,351 per dollar. What is this? No one had known about this at the time. If that is true, the motive for murder becomes clearer as money. However, at the time of the incident, the police, perhaps reassured by having already arrested a suspect, did not carefully examine the insurance details. This complacency became fatal, and at the Supreme Court, the motive could not be established, leading to, "It does not seem like solicitation of murder." Fortunately, after the insurance employee learned of this, a person with connections quietly informed the long-term cold case task force at the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency. But at this point, Mr. Park had already been acquitted at the Supreme Court. He could not be indicted for the same charge. The police did not say, "There is nothing we can do," but with a sense of duty that the victim's grievance should be resolved, they secretly began a reinvestigation. They secured the life insurance applications in Miss Cho's name and began to compare handwriting. Whether she had enrolled herself was in question. They needed to verify the handwriting, but the husband had burned all of the keepsakes. Where could they find her handwriting? At that time, they learned that Ms. Cho had belatedly studied at a high school in Hwagok-dong. They very narrowly managed to find her admission application. They tried to compare, but the materials were limited. The handwriting analysis ultimately failed. The investigation team did not give up and closely examined the policy applications again. There, they found a very important clue. The contact number for the policyholder was not Ms. Cho's own number. It was a third party's number. They sought advice from Miss Cho's younger sister. "Do you know what number this might be?" The younger sister slowly searched her memory and said, "Detective, I think I saw this contact in my sister's email address book." It turned out that Ms. Cho had long suspected her husband's adultery, so she had written down separately the names and contact information of female believers to monitor. Among those listed was a person labeled A. The number listed for that woman matched the number on the insurance application. Therefore, that woman was highly likely to be Mr. Park's paramour. Next, the police showed the insurance agent a photograph of Miss A and asked, "Was it this woman who came to enroll?" The agent nodded. Moreover, there was something memorable from the consultation. It was memorable because she had said her husband was a daechoseong, which was unusual, and so it stuck in the agent's memory for a long time. In other words, the paramour Miss A had enrolled the policies in Miss Cho's name on her behalf. This is illegal. For that matter, Miss A was arrested by the police. She eventually confessed to participating in the insurance fraud. The arrow then pointed straight to Mr. Park. At this point, the investigation ran into a difficulty. Mr. Park had already left Korea. He had been acquitted in May of 2005 and had received 800 million won, approximately $590,000 in insurance proceeds, but he reportedly squandered most of it on attorney's fees. He then disposed of the temple, and in March of 2006 moved to Cambodia with his 2 children. The police cooperated with Cambodia to track his whereabouts. That was not easy and failed. The remaining method was to issue an Interpol red notice and await his return, but that had no definite timeline. Who knew where he was, and why would he voluntarily return? Just when the investigation's momentum was flagging, surprisingly, only 4 months later, in September of 2012, Mr. Park suddenly appeared in Korea. It turned out that not long before, while working in the jungle, he had broken his leg. Given the poor local conditions, treatment was not possible. Unaware that an insurance fraud investigation connected to him was underway in Korea, he returned for treatment. As soon as he set foot on Korean soil, he was taken into police custody. Of course, he could not be punished for the murder. He was held to account for the insurance fraud. Even then, Mr. Park denied the charges like a slippery fish. He said he was not involved at all, and that he had been completely deceived by the paramour. This man is truly exasperating. What an incredible case this is. By a chain of coincidences, in a single year, the full inside story of the murder case came to light. But as mentioned in the introduction, under the principle of double jeopardy, they could not put the instigator of murder, Mr. Park, on trial. If the insurance company employee had not casually pulled out that old insurance contract, and if Ms. Cho's younger sister had not recalled the phone number list her sister had written, this would have remained hidden. Imagine this: 23 men and only one woman stranded on an uninhabited island. This is the premise of the Japanese film Tokyo Island, which was released in 2010. From the very beginning, this kind of story ignites genuine curiosity and even a sense of unease. After all, such unusual circumstances are rare, aren't they? But what's most surprising is that the film is actually based on real events that occurred in the past. Events that proved to be even more dramatic and cinematic than the film itself. It all began on a small island in the Pacific Ocean. Anahan Island, a tiny volcanic island located approximately 120 kilometers north of Saipan, part of the Mariana Archipelago in the Pacific, is barely 32 square kilometers in area. Its length from west to east stretches 9 kilometers, while its width is only 3.7 kilometers. To give a clearer picture of its size, one might say that this island is slightly smaller than Gangnam-gu, one of the districts in Seoul. The central part of Anahan is almost entirely engulfed in dense jungle vegetation, creating a feeling of total isolation from the outside world. In the 1940s, Anahan Island was under Japanese control. A company called Namyang operated here, managing an extensive coconut plantation that turned this small island into an economically significant site for Japan's interests in the region. At dawn on the 12th of June 1944, in the midst of the Pacific War, unexpected visitors arrived on the island, survivors of a maritime disaster. These survivors were Japanese sailors, young men recently drafted into the Japanese Navy. They were en route to Saipan, traveling on an aging fishing schooner when they suddenly came under fire from American forces. Miraculously, the battered boat, despite suffering significant damage, managed to carry them to the nearest island, which turned out to be Anahan. By then, the schooner was in such a sorry state that continuing the journey was completely out of the question. 31 people landed on the island. Among them were 10 Japanese soldiers and 21 conscripted sailors. All were men, most of them teenagers or very young adults, around 16 to 20 years old. These young men, who had yet to face the hardships of adult life, now found themselves thrust into the heart of war, far from home and in utterly unfamiliar surroundings. At the time, about 50 local residents lived on Anahan, forming a dynamic but secluded community. There were also only 2 Japanese nationals on the island, Mr. Ichiro Higaki, the manager of the coconut plantation, and his wife, Mrs. Kazu Higaki. Notably, the nature of Ichiro and Kazu's marriage was evident only from their shared surname, as Japanese tradition dictated that a wife always took her husband's family name. Although the survivors had reached the island, their situation was far from safe or peaceful. The war raged on, and tensions mounted to unbearable levels. The United States had focused its efforts on capturing Saipan, resulting in heavy regular bombings that targeted not only that island, but also the nearby territories, including Anahan. All remaining boats on Anahan were destroyed, leaving the island's residents and the new arrivals effectively trapped, with no means of escape. On this isolated island, surrounded by hostile seas and marked by the scars of war, 31 surviving Japanese sailors and about 50 local residents remained. They were young, full of vitality, and prepared to fight for survival. The first issue the survivors encountered was a simple yet crucial one: food. Initially, it seemed there was enough to go around, but soon it became clear they were consuming far more than they could afford. Within a month, all food stores on the island had run dry. The last pigs and chickens kept by the locals for food were gone. The Japanese were forced to rely on coconuts and bananas from the plantations, but these were insufficient. Soon, to survive, they began hunting wild lizards and even bats. In these conditions, conventional ways of making fire were impossible. To manage the cold nights and cook food, they resorted to ancient methods. Rubbing wooden sticks together, they created fire like primal humans stranded in a different era. Another long, grueling year had passed. By July of 1945, as the war neared its end, Anahan was subjected to yet another massive aerial assault by American forces. This marked a critical moment. American troops landed on the island and began rounding up its inhabitants. Seeing that they had no other choice, the locals chose to surrender. They joined the Americans, who offered them a chance to leave Anahan. The only way off the island was to board an American ship, which became their deliverance. However, for the two original Japanese residents of Anahan and the 31 recently arrived Japanese sailors, the Americans were still the enemy. To them, surrender felt like betrayal. So they chose to stay on the island, hiding deep within the jungles to avoid any contact with the American forces. As a result, Anahan was left completely devoid of its local population, with only the Japanese survivors remaining, turning the island into their final, desperate stronghold. On August 15, 1945, Japan officially surrendered, bringing World War II to an end at last. American forces, now in control of the captured territories, used loudspeakers to inform the remaining Japanese soldiers on Anahan of the war's end, urging them to cease their resistance and surrender voluntarily. But the Japanese on Anahan met this news with deep skepticism. They had no reason to trust the Americans' words. They were convinced that surrender meant certain death. This belief only grew stronger as deafening explosions echoed from nearby Saipan, close enough for the sounds to reach Anahan. In reality, the Americans were disposing of leftover bombs, but the Japanese were convinced these were signs that the fighting continued, a clear indication that the war was far from over. The sounds of explosions from Saipan became indisputable proof for the Japanese on Anahan. The Americans were lying, and the war was still ongoing. While the Americans made attempts to evacuate the remaining Japanese soldiers from the island, the situation grew more tense, and their persuasion efforts proved fruitless. Realizing that convincing them was hopeless, the Americans decided to leave them on Anahan, turning the island into a sealed trap for those who stubbornly refused to believe in the end of the war. A considerable amount of time passed. Gradually, the explosions ceased, the bombing stopped, and a silence fell over Anahan that had not been heard in a long time. Slowly, the Japanese came to the realization that the war had indeed ended. Bit by bit, they emerged from the jungles where they had been hiding and began to build a new life on the island, not as soldiers, but simply as survivors. Conditions on the island improved noticeably. The men took to farming, fishing in the sea, stockpiling food, and even learned to make alcoholic drinks from the coconuts growing on the plantations. Once their primary needs for food and safety were met, life began to settle and another instinct surfaced among the men, a sexual desire they could no longer ignore. There was only one woman left on Anahan, Kazuko Higa. She was believed to be Kikuchiro's wife, a belief held by all the men. However, persistent rumors soon began to circulate across the island. Kazuko and Kikuchiro were not, in fact, married as everyone had assumed. These rumors turned out to be true. For a long time, it was assumed they had a marital relationship, but it became clear that their bond was merely a facade, and their shared residence involved no obligations to each other beyond the mutual struggle for survival. Kazuko Higa was originally from Okinawa. In 1938, when she was just 15 years old, she met the man who became her true husband, Shoichi Higa, on the island of Saipan. He worked for the Namyang Company, and shortly after their marriage, he was transferred to Anahan Island. At 18, Kazuko followed him, leaving her former life behind and starting anew on this remote island. On Anahan, Shoichi held a respectable position, but he had a superior, Kikuchiro Higa, who had already been living on the island when the couple arrived. The shared surname of Shoichi and Kikuchiro was purely coincidental, having nothing to do with their personal lives. In reality, Kikuchiro was her husband's supervisor, and Kazuko's relationship with him was strictly formal. Everything changed suddenly when one day Shoichi decided to journey to a neighboring island to meet and bring back his sister. It was at that very moment that the American bombings began, and all contact with Shoichi was lost. His whereabouts remained unknown, and despite all her efforts, Kazuko was unable to discover what had happened to him. She continued to wait and hope, but he never returned. Kikuchiro's family, her husband's superior, also lived on Saipan, and contact with them was lost as well, as though fate had swept them away into the unknown. Soon, Kazuko and Kikuchiro were the only two left on Anahan. But their peace was short-lived. The sudden arrival of Japanese sailors on the island startled Kazuko and awakened a sense of fear. She was now the only woman on the island, surrounded by young, lonely men, placing her in a potentially dangerous situation. To protect herself, Kazuko decided to rely on Kikuchiro, posing as his wife for appearance's sake. This act became her shield against the men's attention. She hoped that this facade would guard her against unwanted looks and actions. However, this decision led to a different kind of misfortune. Kikuchiro, who grew increasingly attached to Kazuko, gradually became obsessed with her. He began to resent even her simple conversations with other men, his jealousy escalating into rage. Kazuko had to endure his outbursts of anger and even violence. Eventually, the truth that they were not actually married came out, and word quickly spread across the island. Upon learning of her true status, the men's behavior toward her shifted. They openly expressed interest in her and sought her attention. The atmosphere on the island grew increasingly alarming and threatening for Kazuko. In August of 1946, a fallen American bomber was discovered deep in the jungle. Among the wreckage, 2 of the survivors found 2 pistols and 70 bullets. The appearance of firearms in such conditions, on an island cut off from the outside world, meant that those who possessed them held a disproportionate power over the others. From that moment on, a menacing tension settled over the survivors. Soon, a terrible tragedy struck the island. One of the men, whom we will call An, fell from a tree and died. Known within the group for his difficult personality, An had tense, even hostile relationships with the 2 men who possessed the pistols. After his death, dark rumors spread throughout the island. Maybe they killed An? Suspicion crept into the group, but the 2 armed men, who we'll refer to as the pair with pistols, ignored the gossip and began openly showing interest in Kazuko, the only woman on the island. Meanwhile, Kikuchiro, who had pretended to be Kazuko's husband and saw himself as her sole protector, realized his influence over the other men had weakened, especially in the presence of those who held weapons. Fearing for his survival, he submitted to these 2, offering them the right to share Kazuko, as if she were an object. This decision turned Kazuko's life into a living nightmare. She was forced to live with 3 men entirely against her will, with no means to defend herself from their control. Yet the tragedies didn't end there. In the fall of 1947, one of the 2 men with pistols was shot dead. The cause of the killing was never determined, but it was suspected that serious disagreements, possibly a struggle for control, had arisen between them. After this incident, Kikuchiro, the plantation manager and Kazuko's former husband, was consumed by fear. He wondered, "Am I next?" Terrified for his life, he left Kazuko with the remaining armed man and withdrew, avoiding any potential conflict. But not long after, the second armed man also met a tragic end, drowning while fishing. This was unexpected and inexplicable, given his skill as a swimmer and fisherman. His death once again shifted the balance of power on the island, sparking a new wave of uncertainty and fear among the survivors. Kazuko, left unprotected, returned to Kikuchiro, as she couldn't bear to be alone. She needed some form of support and security. At this point, only 27 men and 1 woman, Kazuko, remained on the island. The pistol left behind by the second man's death passed into the hands of yet another person. But even that didn't stop the string of mysterious deaths. Soon after, Kikuchiro died, and the circumstances surrounding his death became a new enigma. Kazuko claimed he had died from food poisoning, but many on the island doubted her words, suspecting that something more sinister might be hidden behind his death. If you think about it, it seems unbelievable. Yet the fact remains, every man who came close to Kazuko ultimately met his end. And this fatal cycle didn't stop even after Kikuchiro's death. The next man to inherit the pistol also perished soon after, swept away by a massive wave while out at sea. The situation on the island took on an ominous turn. Each man who possessed the weapon and stayed close to Kazuko seemed destined for doom. This string of deaths fueled more and more talk, and superstitions on the island grew rampant, as if Kazuko herself were a harbinger of misfortune. Of the original 31 men stranded on Anahan, only 23 remained. At this point, an unexpected shift took place on the island. Realizing the futility of their situation and the danger of endless conflict, the men made a surprising decision. They threw the pistol into the sea, symbolically rejecting the source of power and division. To restore peace and order, they proposed that Kazuko choose a husband of her own, one she truly wanted. Moreover, they agreed that no one else would bother her, no matter how strong their personal desires. For the first time, it seemed as if the island could experience a long-awaited peace. But this harmony was deceptive. Before long, tensions flared again as the men began quarreling over Kazuko, rekindling disputes that only worsened the situation. No agreements could suppress the mounting tension, and with no way to resolve their frustrations, the men sought an explanation for their misery. Gradually, a strange yet overpowering belief took hold among them. All the misfortunes, all the deaths surrounding them, were caused by Kazuko. The men began to blame her, as if she were the source of a curse, and soon this led them to a horrifying decision. They concluded that Kazuko had to be executed to end their suffering once and for all. Kazuko, left with no choice but to fight for her life, realized she had to escape or face certain death. In June of 1950, she made a desperate move. She sought help from the Americans, sending out a distress signal. She fully understood that surrendering to the Americans could also mean danger. After all, she had grown up thinking of them as the enemy, but this was her only hope for survival. At 30 years old, she was finally taken into American custody, gaining the long-awaited freedom she had all but given up on. After her release, Kazuko returned to her native Okinawa, but the weight of her past still clung to her. She shared the news that Japanese survivors remained stranded on Anahan, cut off from the world. By the spring of 1951, an active campaign in Japan had begun to rescue those left behind. Families of the survivors, learning of their loved ones' fate, gathered and sent letters that were delivered to Anahan via leaflets. Knowing that the Japanese on the island might distrust strangers, they reached out through these family members, hoping to establish contact and convince them it was safe. Relatives and friends tried to communicate the truth of the war's end, hoping this would bring them home. At first, none of the Japanese on Anahan believed the messages. Even when they saw leaflets with appeals from relatives, they suspected it might be a trick, a trap set by the Americans to capture them. They hid in the jungle once more, fearing deception. But over time, one of the men recognized his family's handwriting on a leaflet, and this small detail changed everything. He decided to emerge from hiding and reach out to the rescue team. His actions inspired others, who slowly began to accept the truth. The war had indeed ended. Gradually, one by one, they came out of the jungle, realizing that the long years of fear and doubt were finally over. In July of 1951, the remaining Japanese on Anahan Island were evacuated and flown home on an American aircraft. By then, only 20 men had survived. Once they returned home, Japanese authorities launched an investigation to uncover what had happened during their years of isolation. In every man's account, Kazuko was an essential figure. What especially stood out was a mysterious pattern. Every man with whom she had lived on the island had died. This fact immediately drew the attention of the press, and soon Kazuko's story became a national sensation. The media dubbed her the Queen of the Island Kazuko, and she became the subject of widespread public fascination. As time passed, the story grew more exaggerated. In their quest for a sensational headline, newspapers began publishing unconfirmed rumors that Kazuko had supposedly chosen men deliberately to use them for her survival. Outsiders painted her as a cold-blooded femme fatale, a manipulator and seductress. Yet the reality was much darker. Kazuko had never chosen partners of her own will. She was a victim of circumstance and coercion, an object of desire and rivalry among men who were vying for dominance and power. All those close to Kazuko were the leaders of the group, which inevitably made them targets for other men eager to claim the top position. Kazuko herself became a casualty of the ruthless struggle for power and survival. But Japanese society at the time, instead of empathizing with her suffering, focused on her alleged sexual role, turning her into a symbol of temptation and seduction. She was quickly labeled a femme fatale, and even after returning home, she continued to face mockery, accusations, and condemnation. The irony of fate is that Kazuko's tragic story unexpectedly brought her fame. Films were made, books were written, and her image became associated with mystery and allure. Her photographs sold like those of a celebrity. Yet the public's fascination was short-lived, and soon it faded, allowing Kazuko to finally find peace. She married and was able to return to the life she had longed for. A simple, quiet existence, far from the scrutiny and suspicions that had haunted her since her time on Anahan. Her long-awaited peaceful life, however, was brief. In 1974, Kazuko was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and at just 49 years old, her life came to an end. The story of Anahan Island remains a stark reminder of what happens when primal instincts and human fears collide under conditions of isolation and brutal inequality. It feels like the plot of a film, yet reality proved far harsher and more dramatic. I am personally struck by the fact that all of this truly happened. When I first heard of Kazuko, the story seemed like mere sensationalism, a legend of a woman surrounded by men on a deserted island. But once you learn the details, it becomes clear. Kazuko was an unwilling victim of circumstances, trapped in a situation from which there was no escape. Not only Kazuko, but the local residents and all the other survivors on Anahan experienced horrors as well. They became casualties of someone else's war, a war they neither wanted nor understood. This story is a bitter reminder that every war is a tragedy for those who are unwillingly swept into its grasp. We must remember this story to prevent such tragedies, born of war, from ever happening again.